Dr. Lee woke up to the sound of alarms blaring throughout the small research station. He rushed to the control room, his eyes still heavy with sleep. The monitor showed a massive solar storm hitting the area. The station shook as the storm intensified. "Systems critical," the computer announced in its flat voice. "Communications offline. External sensors detecting foreign object." Lee checked the exterior cameras. Through the swirling solar winds, he could make out something metallic tumbling toward the station. It wasn't debris. It was some kind of small craft. "Computer, activate emergency landing protocols," Lee ordered. The station's magnetic field extended, slowing the approaching object until it gently bounced against the outer hull. Lee grabbed his emergency kit and rushed to the airlock. Whatever it was, it had likely been damaged in the storm. When Lee opened the outer door, he found a small pod unlike any human design he'd seen before. Its surface was smooth with strange symbols etched into the metal. A cracked viewport revealed a figure inside, motionless. "Hello," Lee called through his helmet comm. No response. With careful movements, Lee attached a tether to the pod and pulled it into the airlock. Once the chamber pressurized, he examined the craft more closely. The hull was warm to the touch and hummed faintly. There was no obvious way to open it. As if sensing his presence, a seam appeared in the metal, widening until the top half of the pod slid away. Inside lay an unconscious humanoid figure. Female, by appearance, but definitely not human. Her skin was a pale lavender color, with faint patterns that seemed to shift beneath the surface. Where a human would have hair, she had what looked like delicate tendrils that moved slightly with each breath. Lee checked for vital signs, relieved to find something similar to a pulse. The alien was injured. A gash along her arm leaked silvery fluid. "Don't worry," Lee said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I'll help you." He carefully lifted her from the pod. She was lighter than she looked, almost weightless in his arms. Lee carried her to the medical bay and placed her on the examination table. The station's medical scanner wasn't designed for alien physiology, but it did its best to assess her condition. Besides the arm wound, she had minor internal injuries and showed signs of exhaustion. Lee cleaned and bandaged the wound, then set up an IV with basic fluids that the scanner suggested would be compatible with her chemistry. There was nothing more he could do but wait. The storm outside grew stronger, cutting off all hope of communication with Earth or the main colonies for at least a week. Lee was on his own with his unexpected guest. 3 hours later, Lee returned to the medical bay to find the alien awake. She was sitting upright, examining the bandage on her arm with evident curiosity. When she noticed Lee, she went completely still. "Hello," Lee said softly, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "My name is Lee. You're safe here." The alien tilted her head, the tendrils around her face moving in a wave-like pattern. She made a sound like chimes in the wind. "I don't understand," Lee admitted. He pointed to himself. "Lee." Then he gestured to her. After a moment, the alien touched her chest and said something that sounded like "Mina." "Mina." Lee repeated. She nodded, the movement oddly human. Lee brought her water and some basic rations. She sniffed them cautiously before taking small sips of the water. The food she examined but did not eat. Over the next few hours, Lee showed Mina around the small station, explaining things as best he could with gestures. She seemed to understand more than she could express, occasionally touching equipment, and then looking at Lee as if asking permission. That night, as Lee prepared a spare cot in the room adjacent to his quarters, he noticed Mina standing by the viewpoint, staring at the solar storm outside. The patterns beneath her skin were glowing faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the flares of the storm. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Lee asked, joining her. "Dangerous, but beautiful." Mina turned to him and made a sound that might have been agreement. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and lightly touched Lee's temple with her fingertips. A flash of images flooded his mind. A world with 3 moons, buildings that seemed to grow rather than be built, and a terrible explosion. Then ships, fighting, escape, and finally the solar storm that had brought her here. Lee gasped as she broke contact. "You're telepathic," he whispered. Mina's skin patterns glowed brighter for a moment before fading again. She looked tired from the effort. "Rest now," Lee said, guiding her to the cot. "We'll figure things out tomorrow." As Mina settled onto the cot, Lee checked the station's systems one last time. The storm would keep them isolated for days. He had no way to communicate with anyone who might know more about Mina's species or how to help her get home. For now, all he could do was offer shelter and hope that the universal language of kindness would be enough until they found a better way to communicate. What Lee didn't know was that the solar radiation had triggered changes in Mina's biology, changes that would soon complicate their peaceful coexistence in ways neither of them could imagine. Lee woke early to check on his alien guest. 3 days had passed since Mina's arrival, and they had developed a simple system of communication. She learned human words quickly, though her pronunciation made them sound musical and strange. "Morning, Mina," Lee said as he entered the common area. He stopped short when he saw her. Mina stood by the viewport, watching the still raging solar storm. But something was different. The faint patterns beneath her lavender skin now glowed with a bright blue light. They pulsed and shifted like waves, creating hypnotic designs across her arms and face. "Mina, are you okay?" Lee approached cautiously. She turned, and Lee noticed her eyes had changed too. Yesterday they had been solid violet, but now they shimmered with flecks of silver. "Lee," she said, her voice higher than usual. "Feel strange." Lee grabbed his medical scanner and ran it over her. The readings made little sense. Her body temperature had increased, and there was unusual activity in what he guessed was her nervous system. "Are you sick? In pain?" Lee asked, concerned. Mina shook her head. "Not pain. Different." She placed her hand on her chest. "Warm. Much energy." Throughout the day, Lee watched Mina grow increasingly restless. She paced the station, touching the walls, staring at the storm, and occasionally making those wind chime sounds to herself. When their hands accidentally brushed as Lee handed her water, he felt a small electric shock. "Sorry," Mina said, pulling back quickly. The patterns on her skin flared brightly before dimming again. By evening, Mina could barely sit still. She moved from room to room, her skin now pulsing with light in rhythm with her breathing. When Lee tried to scan her again, the device short-circuited. "Something's happening to you," Lee said, trying to hide his worry. "Can you tell me? Show me like before." Mina looked at him for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. "Too personal. Private." She seemed embarrassed, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to contain the light. That night, Lee woke to the sound of glass breaking. He rushed to Mina's room and found her standing amid shattered pieces of a water glass, her skin glowing so brightly that the room was lit as if by daylight. "Can't control," she said, distressed. "Sorry, Lee." As Lee helped clean up the glass, he noticed the room's temperature was several degrees warmer than the rest of the station. Small objects around Mina, a pen, a metal spoon, hovered slightly above the surfaces where they should have been resting. "You have telekinetic abilities too?" Lee asked, amazed. "Not before," Mina replied, looking just as surprised. "Only mine speak." She tapped her temple. Storm changed something. The next morning, Lee found Mina in the science lab, studying the station's database on a tablet. When she saw him, she quickly switched it off. "What were you looking at?" Lee asked gently. Mina hesitated. "Your science. Biology." Looking for answers. Lee sat beside her, careful to maintain distance. "Tell me what's happening, Mina. Maybe I can help." She looked down, the glow beneath her skin pulsing in what Lee now recognized as embarrassment. "My people have cycle, like earth animals, for making new life." Lee's eyes widened with understanding. "A reproductive cycle, a mating season." Minna nodded, not meeting his eyes. Should happen next year. But solar radiation. She gestured to the storm outside. Made it start now. So these changes are part of your normal biology. Just triggered early. Yes, but dangerous here. No others of my kind. She finally looked up at him. Energy bills. No release. Lee ran a hand through his hair, trying to process this information. Is it dangerous to you? To your health? Can be. Minna admitted. Need special rooms at home. Rooms that absorb energy. As if to emphasize her point, the lights in the lab flickered. The tablet between them turned on by itself, cycling rapidly through different screens. I see the problem, Lee said, watching as his coffee mug slid across the table without being touched. Your energy is affecting our equipment. Later that day, Lee found Minna huddled in a corner of the storage room, as far from the electronic equipment as possible. Her skin was now so bright that it hurt to look at her directly. Made this for you, Lee said, holding out what looked like a thick blanket. It's lined with our radiation shielding material. Might help contain some of the energy. Minna wrapped it around herself gratefully. The glow dimmed slightly, but her discomfort was still obvious. Thank you, she said, but temporary only, getting stronger. Lee sat on a crate across from her. The storm should clear in about 3 days. Then we can call for help. Maybe too late, Minna whispered. When cycle peaks. She trailed off, looking away. What happens then? Lee asked. Minna's eyes met his, silver flecks now swirling like stars. Energy release. Big release. She made an expanding gesture with her hands. Could damage station. Could hurt you. Lee felt a chill despite the warmth radiating from Minna. They were isolated with limited resources, and now facing a biological crisis neither of them fully understood. We'll figure something out, Lee promised, though he had no idea what that might be. There must be a way to help you through this safely. Minna's only response was a sad smile as the lights around them flickered again, and somewhere deep in the station, an alarm began to sound. The alarm blared throughout the station, its shrill sound making Lee wince as he rushed to the control room. Minna followed closely behind, the shielding blanket wrapped tightly around her glowing form. Station systems critical, the computer announced. Unexpected energy surge detected in life support modules. Lee's fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to locate the source of the problem. The station's diagnostics showed power fluctuations spreading from section to section, following the path Minna had walked earlier. It's your energy, Lee said, turning to Minna. It's interfering with the station's electronics. Minna's face fell, her skin dimming slightly with what Lee had come to recognize as shame. Did not mean to cause trouble. I know, Lee assured her, but we need to understand what's happening better so I can help. After rerouting critical systems to isolated circuits, Lee and Minna sat in the medical bay. He had prepared a simple meal for them both, though Minna had barely touched hers. The patterns on her skin had changed, now forming complex spirals that pulsed with light. Can you explain more about this cycle? Lee asked gently. In your culture, what would normally happen? Minna was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Very private, not speak of to outsiders. She looked down at her hands, which now glowed so brightly that Lee could see the outline of her bones. But you need know. She explained that her people, the Lumina, experienced a synchronization cycle once every 3 years. During this time, they gathered in special chambers designed to harmlessly absorb and redirect their excess energy. The chambers were sacred spaces where Lumina would form temporary mental connections with compatible partners. Mental bond important, Minna said. Without it, energy has no focus. Becomes wild. She gestured to the flickering lights around them. Like this. So without another Lumina to bond with, your energy has nowhere to go. Lee asked, trying to understand. Yes, and worse with time. Minna's expression grew concerned. Peak will come soon. Maybe 2 days. What happens at the peak? Mina's luminescent patterns intensified, pulsing rapidly. Energy release, very powerful. On my world, special rooms contain it. She looked around the station. Here, could damage everything, could harm you. Lee ran a hand through his hair, thinking, is there any way to, I don't know, ground the energy, direct it somewhere safe? Mina tilted her head, considering, maybe. Need material that conducts but doesn't break. And she hesitated, her skin flashing with embarrassment. Need help focus mind. What kind of help? On my world, elders guide first cycle. Use special songs, special words. Help direct thoughts. Lee nodded slowly. Like meditation. Similar, yes. Mina stood suddenly, her blanket slipping. The tools on the medical tray began to float. But personal, very personal. In my culture, only family or bondmates see this state. Lee understood her discomfort now. This wasn't just a biological process. It was something deeply private in her culture, something not shared with strangers. I'm sorry you're going through this away from your people, Lee said softly. It must be frightening. Mina's eyes met his, silver swirls moving like tiny galaxies. You're not afraid of me. Why would I be afraid? Most species fear what they don't understand. And she gestured to herself. This not normal for you. Lee smiled. I've spent my life studying the unknown, Mina. I'm more curious than afraid. That evening, as Lee searched the station's database for materials that might safely channel Mina's energy, he heard a crash from her quarters. He found her surrounded by floating objects, her skin so bright it hurt to look at directly. Losing control, she gasped. Memory coming. Hard to separate. What do you mean? Lee asked, ducking as a book flew past his head. Cycle brings ancestor memories. Knowledge passed down. Mina pressed her hands to her temples. Too much. No training. Lee watched as she struggled, feeling helpless. Then he remembered something. On Earth, some cultures use rhythmic sounds to help focus the mind during important rituals. Would something like that help? Mina nodded desperately. Yes. Rhythm important. Lee found an old music player and selected a simple, steady drumbeat. As the sound filled the room, Mina closed her eyes and began to sway slightly. The floating objects gradually lowered, though they didn't quite touch the ground. Better, she whispered. Helps focus. Over the next hours, Lee learned more about the luminous sacred cycle than any outsider had ever known. Mina explained that during this time, her people shared ancestral memories and strengthened their community bonds. It wasn't just reproduction, it was cultural transmission, a way of preserving their history and knowledge. So beautiful at home, she said wistfully. Light from many together. Stories shared mind to mind. Her expression darkened. Alone, just pain and chaos. Lee sat across from her, careful to maintain the distance she needed. You're not completely alone, Mina. I'm here. For the first time that day, the patterns on Mina's skin formed what looked like a smile. Yes, strange human who not run away. As night fell, Mina's condition worsened. The drumbeat no longer helped as much, and the station's systems fluctuated dangerously. Lee knew they were running out of time. Tomorrow, I'll build something to channel your energy, he promised. We'll get through this. What Lee didn't say was that he had no idea if his hastily conceived plan would work, and even if it did, the cultural gulf between them remained. What was sacred and private for her was a scientific puzzle for him, a misunderstanding that could have consequences neither of them could predict. Lee worked through the night, his hands moving quickly as he connected the last wires. The station's workshop was filled with dismantled equipment, parts from the backup generator, pieces of the communication array, and sections of the radiation shielding. What he was building had never existed before, but it was their only hope. Almost done, Lee muttered to himself as he tightened a final connection. The contraption looked strange. A circular platform surrounded by metal rods that curved upward like a cage. Thin wires wrapped around each rod, connecting to a series of crystal capacitors that Lee had salvaged from the station's deep space scanner. The door to the workshop slid open, and Minna entered. Lee gasped when he saw her. Her entire body now glowed like a blue sun, so bright that he had to squint. The air around her shimmered with heat and energy. Small tools and parts floated in her wake, orbiting her like tiny moons. "Not much time," Minna said, her voice strained. "Peak coming soon." Lee nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I think this will work. I've created a conductive chamber that should absorb and ground your excess energy." He pointed to the crystal capacitors. "These can store massive amounts of power before transferring it safely to the station's outer hull." Minna approached the device cautiously. The metal rod seemed to bend toward her slightly, attracted by her energy field. "Like home chambers," she whispered, a hint of hope in her voice. "But missing something." "What's missing?" Lee asked. "Mind focus. Need direction for energy." Minna's skin pulsed rapidly, and a nearby screen cracked. "Sorry, hard to control." Lee thought quickly. "You said elders help guide thoughts during the cycle. What do they do exactly?" Minna closed her eyes, remembering. "They sing special songs, create mental pictures, help energy find right paths." "I'm not a Lumina elder, but maybe I can help," Lee offered. "Tell me what to do." Minna looked uncertain. "Would require connection, like when I showed you my home, but deeper." The patterns on her skin shifted into what Lee recognized as worry. "Could be dangerous for you. More dangerous than having the station explode." Lee asked with a small smile. Minna didn't smile back. "Yes. Could harm your mind. Humans not made for Lumina thoughts." Lee checked the station's systems on his tablet. Power fluctuations were getting worse. The life support system was already operating on emergency backup. They were running out of options. "We have to try," he said firmly. "I trust you, Minna." After a moment's hesitation, Minna nodded. "Stand there," she instructed, pointing to a spot near the center of the device. "I will be inside circle." Lee took his position as Minna stepped onto the platform. Immediately, the metal rods began to hum, and the crystal capacitors glowed faintly. "Now what?" Lee asked. "Close eyes, open mind." Minna raised her hand slowly. "We'll try to be gentle." Lee closed his eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt it, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness, like someone calling his name from very far away. The whisper grew stronger, becoming a gentle pressure against his thoughts. "Don't resist." Minna's voice came both from outside and inside his mind. "Let me in." Lee took a deep breath and imagined opening a door in his mind. Suddenly, his consciousness exploded with light and sensation. He saw / felt / heard Minna's presence, not as a physical form, but as a complex pattern of energy and thought. Behind her stretched what seemed like countless other patterns, ancestral memories cascading through her being. "Too much," Lee gasped, his knees buckling. "Focus," Minna's thought voice guided him. "See the energy. Help me direct it." Through their connection, Lee understood what she needed. The excess energy building in her system needed pathways, channels to flow through safely. In his mind's eye, he imagined rivers of light flowing from Minna into the device he had built. The physical world disappeared as Lee and Minna worked together in this strange mental landscape. He showed her how to channel her energy into the capacitors, while she taught him how to create mental barriers to protect himself from the overflow. Time lost meaning. Lee felt as if he was floating in a sea of blue light, guiding currents with his thoughts. Through their connection, he caught glimpses of Minna's world, cities made of crystal that channeled and amplified the luminous natural light, vast chambers where hundreds gathered during the synchronization cycle, the beauty of shared memories flowing from one generation to the next. He also felt her emotions, her fear of being trapped forever in this painful state, her embarrassment at sharing something so intimate with an alien, and her growing trust in him. Suddenly, Lee felt a surge building within Mina's energy field. "It's coming," her thought voice warned. "The peak." "I'm ready," Lee responded, bracing himself mentally. The surge hit like a tsunami. Energy poured from Mina into the device, through their mental connection, and into the station itself. The crystal capacitors glowed white-hot as they absorbed the power, channeling it safely into the station's outer hull. In their shared mental space, Lee held firm against the flood, maintaining the pathways they had created together. He felt as if he was standing in the center of a star, holding back its power through sheer will. Then, slowly, the surge began to fade. The pressure eased. The blinding light dimmed to a manageable glow. When Lee finally opened his physical eyes, he found himself lying on the floor beside the device. Mina knelt next to him, her skin now emitting just a soft, gentle luminescence. The station's lights were steady, and the persistent alarm had finally gone silent. "You did it," Lee whispered, his voice hoarse. Mina shook her head, her eyes filled with wonder. "We did it, together." 2 days after the peak of Mina's cycle, the solar storm finally began to clear. Lee sat at the communications console, adjusting frequencies and trying to establish contact with anyone who might be searching for Mina. "Any luck?" Mina asked, entering the control room. Her skin had returned to its normal lavender color, with only faint patterns visible beneath the surface. The overwhelming glow was gone, leaving her looking much as she had when she first arrived. "Not yet," Lee replied, turning another dial. "But the interference is getting weaker. We should be able to reach someone soon." Mina nodded and took a seat beside him. Since they had successfully channeled her energy through Lee's makeshift device, things had settled into a comfortable routine. The station was functioning normally again, and Mina was no longer in pain. "Feels strange," she admitted. "First cycle always special for my people, shared with family, with community." She looked around the small control room. "Not expected like this." Lee smiled. "I imagine not. Meeting an alien during your first reproductive cycle wasn't in your plans, I'm sure." "No," Mina agreed, returning his smile. "But good fortune still. You helped when others might fear." The brief mental connection they had shared during the peak had changed something between them. Though the deep link was gone, an understanding remained. Lee had glimpsed Mina's culture in ways no human ever had, and she had experienced his thoughts in return. The console suddenly crackled with static, and a voice broke through. "Repeat. This is Lumina Vessel Starlight responding to distress signal. Any survivors of Research Ship Horizon, please respond." Mina leaped to her feet, her skin briefly flashing with excitement. "My people. They search for me." Lee adjusted the signal and opened the channel. "This is Research Station 12. We have a survivor from the horizon. Her name is Mina." There was a pause, then, "Station 12, please confirm. You have a Lumina female. Is she well?" Lee glanced at Mina, who nodded eagerly. "Yes, she's well. She experienced her synchronization cycle while here, but we managed to handle it." Another, longer pause followed. When the voice returned, it sounded shocked. "You assisted Illumina through first synchronization. This is unprecedented." Over the next hour, Lee coordinated with the Lumina ship. It would arrive within a day to retrieve Mina and assess the situation. After ending the transmission, Lee found Mina in the observation room, staring out at the fading solar storm. "Your people seemed surprised that I helped you," Lee remarked, joining her by the viewport. Mina nodded. "As I said, very private. In past, other species who witnessed cycle often reacted with fear or wrong interest." She turned to face him. "You different. Respected boundaries. Created solution." "I just did what anyone would do," Lee said. "No," Mina replied firmly. "Not what anyone would do. Special." The next morning, the Lumina ship arrived. It was beautiful. a sleek vessel that seemed to be made of the same crystal-like material as the capacitors Lee had used in his device. When it docked with the station, 3 Lumina entered. They were similar to Mina, but taller, with more complex patterns beneath their skin. The leader introduced himself as Tai, chief scientist of the Horizon mission. He looked at Lee with open curiosity. "You are the human who assisted Mina through synchronization." Lee nodded. "I built a device to help channel her energy safely." Tai turned to Mina, and they communicated silently for a moment, their skin patterns flashing in complex sequences. Then Tai looked back at Lee with new respect. "Most remarkable. Our medical officer wishes to examine both you and your device, if permitted." "Of course," Lee agreed. The examination took several hours. The Lumina medical officer, Gina, scanned both Lee and the device he had built, taking extensive notes. She seemed particularly interested in how a human mind had withstood contact with Lumina energy. "No lasting damage," she concluded, sounding impressed. "Your mind adapted. Very unusual." As the day ended, it was time for Mina to leave with her people. She found Lee in the workshop, where he was cleaning up the parts of his dismantled device. "Keep this," she said, handing him one of the crystal capacitors. It glowed faintly blue, containing a small portion of her energy. "Remember." Lee accepted it with a smile. "I don't think I could forget if I tried." Mina hesitated, then stepped forward and placed her hand gently against his temple. The brief touch sent a warm tingle through his mind. Not the overwhelming flood of their previous connection, but a gentle reminder. "My people wish to learn from you," she said. "Your solution to cycle problem could help others, could change how we interact with other species. I'd be happy to share what I learned," Lee replied. "More than that," Mina continued. "Council sends message, wishes formal contact with humans. Beginning of new relationship." Lee raised his eyebrows in surprise. "All because of what happened here?" "Yes, you showed respect for sacred things, helped without taking advantage." Mina's skin patterns formed what Lee now recognized as a smile. Good foundation for trust. As they walked to the airlock where the other Lumina waited, Lee realized how much had changed in just a week. What had begun as an emergency rescue had become a first contact situation that might change both their species. "Will you come back someday?" Lee asked. "When it's not your mating season, perhaps." Mina laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Yes, as ambassador maybe. And next cycle." Her skin flashed briefly with humor. "We'll have proper chamber ready." The Lumina ship departed that evening, leaving Lee alone again in his research station. But as he watched it disappear into the stars, the crystal in his pocket glowed warmly. Something new had begun here, something unexpected and promising. And all because he had opened his door to a stranger during a storm.